So one of my favorite authors is Brian McLaren. I have done a couple of studies with him. When we were having home group, we went through a book called We Make the Road by Walking, and we've done a few other things. This is his latest book, and I thought it was very interesting. And so I thought I would give you a summary of the book. You might be interested in reading it, or this might, uh, you know, be enough information. But what he is dealing with is, um, how sustainable uh, is the type of life that we're living as we look into the future. Well, one of the things that I was playing around with for our last Sunday morning series was to talk a little bit about um, how God is going to mend the universe, how he's going to mend creation, how he's going to restore it, and so forth. So I found this book and got it from the library and read through it, took some notes on it, and I think it's insightful. And as we talk about it here tonight, you can give me your impressions on it. So the full title of the book is Life After Doom: Wisdom and Courage in a World Falling Apart. And he has a specific idea in mind when he's talking about the word doom, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So when we take a look at this, there's the cover of the book. It begins talking about the power of stories and how they shape us. They often inform us of the things that we should value and what we should live for. And he talks a little bit about how we have all been shaped by various scripts, especially for those of us who live under a capitalist type of arrangement in the country. And he talks a little bit about these scripts of what he calls domination, greed, and despair. And his idea of doom is this sustainable? Can we continue to live by the type of stories that we have been shaped by? And so the book isn't really a book that is sugarcoating anything. It's pretty straightforward and says really we only have four scenarios. If civilization continues on the trajectory that it's going, we either make adjustments and avoid it, or we experience certain types of collapse, but we're able to rebirth after that. He talks a little bit about collapse, and only a remnant of people will be able to survive that. Or the last scenario is collapse and extinction of the human race, especially in light of nuclear war and other things that did not threaten humanity in years past. So here's how he approaches it. When you open the book, it has four divisions to it. The first one's called Letting Go, then Letting Be, Letting Come, and Setting Free. And letting go is a little bit about releasing the illusions we live by, that we can have endless production without an effect upon the environment. And he talks a little bit about letting go of these illusions and kind of grabbing a hold of reality. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about what he kind of sees taking place. The second section is letting be. And he's talking about accepting the fact that we live in certain destructive cultural patterns, whether it's ecological overshoot or religion that has gone astray or secular failures that have promised things but can't deliver. Then letting come is acknowledging that we live in cycles that has been true in the history of the world, that civilizations rise, decline, fall, and then reemerge in a different way. So then he finally comes down to the end of the book and talks about setting free by seeking beauty, even when there are these things that threaten humanity as a whole, and in particular the planet that we live on. So I'm going to break it down a little bit for us here, and you can jump in anytime you like if you have a question or insight that you'd like to comment. So here's what I think is the central theme of the book. As I was reading through it, the idea of doom is the idea of certain things that you just cannot fully overcome without certain consequences or effects. And so for McLaren, doom is not just doomsday. Doom is this idea of kind of waking up, that you get this feeling, kind of, as I put here, kind of an unsettling awareness that there are certain things that we have messed up along the way. Our planet is feeling the effects of it. We feel the effects of it, and that we made a mess of civilization. And civilization, he is using as a synonym for any large, complex society. In other words, it's something that is a network, an interconnection of all kinds of different influences that make up the type of life we live. And so doom is kind of waking up and then coming to a realization, whether it is environmental crises, wildfires, climate change, those type of things, or ecological overshoot, cutting down too many trees, not allowing the ground to be able to recover. And then on the more human side, the idea of economic injustice. Can a civilization really survive if the top 5% of any nation holds 90% of the wealth? That type of thing. And then he talks a little bit about the collapse of political and religious structures and that type of thing. Now, one thing I think that's important for us to think about as followers of Christ is many times in church world, um, we get drawn into big arguments about tiny matters. And what I mean by that is, most recent example is, okay, now the big argument that has taken place in the last couple of days is Cracker Barrel changing its logo. Okay, there's a big upheaval. We're not going to go to Cracker Barrel anymore and eat there anymore because they took the old guy that's sitting by the barrel off their logo. McLaren is saying that's a waste of time. It's just a waste of time to argue about little things like that, especially in religious circles. Um, Another example might be um, the cultural battle that's going on because outside the Pulse nightclub, where that shooting took place a number of years ago, um, the Trump administration wanted to paint over the rainbow walkway that was painted in honor of those that lost their lives. Well, his point is not that these things aren't important, but in comparison to other things that are really life-threatening, we tend to get drawn into these tiny cultural battles rather than keeping perspective. And one reason he says that we tend to do this is we tend to make so many cultural things a part of the equation of salvation and so, who's right in Christianity. Um, it could be as something as simple as we use the right Bible translation, you don't. But it gets more complex than that. But he suggests that one of the reasons we get drawn into these cultural battles is because we've been conditioned to think that the primary focus of Christianity is to prepare people for the afterlife, and that we shouldn't really care about the earth that we're living on. And with that in mind, we've ignored a lot of things that we should keep up with. And and all of a sudden, when things start to hit us. Shelley, I remember when you said you came back from your Alaska trip and stuff, how some of those ice structures have shrunk. You wake up at times when you go, oh, I see firsthand what scientists are saying, that the environment is warming up and the world is warming up, that type of thing. So he's talking a little bit about we made a mess of this planet that we've lived on for all these years, but we tend to ignore it, or we think that we'll deal with that later when it gets real threatening. And he's suggesting that that is coming sooner than what we think it is. So he then presents these four scenarios. Number one is collapse can be avoided if humanity recognizes its dangers in time to make enough changes to make life on this planet sustainable. Um, and he suggests that it will take a collective will for people to make these changes involving economics and politics and religious systems as well to prioritize sustainability of life on Earth. He also talks about um, how we tend to avoid collapse by just fixing uh, putting the fire out rather than taking care of the cause of it. In other words, as I put here on the slide, he cautions that avoiding collapse without fundamentally rethinking our values, systems, and relationship with the earth may amount to a dangerous illusion. In other words, we might be fooling ourselves thinking that we've taken care of the problem, but we really haven't. So he is suggesting that in the research of scientists, that we're about 250 years away from a tipping point that is, you cannot come back from. Now, the problem with that is who thinks in terms of 250-year time frames, right? We're not going to be around in 250 years. So um, it's hard to psychologically engage with that when we think, oh, that's down the line. But there are elements that we're, or hints that we're seeing, and he suggests that the danger doesn't lie just in the collapse itself, but how we go about clinging to the systems that cause the problems, and we're not willing to make adjustments, even though we could. So he suggests scenario number one is we could avoid collapse, but it will be a bit painful, and we'll have to change the way we think about certain things. Secondly, he talks about collapse and rebirth. And in this scenario, he's talking about sometimes when something collapses, it's not all bad because it becomes the womb of renewal. It becomes the means of change. And he talks a little bit about the death and resurrection model. Remember when Jesus said, unless a seed falls into the ground, it cannot produce fruit. In other words, sometimes things must die before new things will emerge. And he suggests that some of the things that we will lose because we ignore some of the problems will lead to the loss of certain things, maybe that we value. But out of that, there might be a renewal and a rebirth of civilization that will be more sustainable. He talks a little bit in this book about what he calls indigenous knowledge or indigenous people and the insights that they have about the earth and what it needs to be done to sustain it. He talks a little bit about death and resurrection being a part of our spiritual tradition, and that resurrection is at the heart of the gospel story, not only in the person of Christ, but also in the promise of resurrection for those that we have lost. And he says sometimes old systems that exploit or dominate or bring about ruin, they must die. And if they die, then a new world could be born that might balance justice, reconciliation, and ecological harmony. The third one is collapse survival. Now, what he's talking about here is something that's severe. And in the book, he talks a little bit about the nation of Israel going into exile. That was collapsed, yet they survived. The temple and the city was destroyed, and the remnant that came back, they were a persistent group because not all of the Israelites came back to the land. But those that did, under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, come back and now they have to adapt and be persistent, even against continued enemies that don't want them to rebuild the city and the walls and around the city and that type of thing. So McLaren talks a little bit about those little enclaves of resilience. In other words, there are certain people that will survive because they have the will to do so. They're willing to change and live differently, even though it will cause a lot of problems, perhaps widespread suffering, whether it's food shortage, famine, different things like this. So right now, collapse survival is describing the Palestinians. That's where they're at. Their whole society has collapsed. Their whole society has been ruined. There's some resilient people that are trying to still get food for their family. Um, and their world will never be the same. Should this continued onslaught by the Israel government, should it ever be resolved and they stop bombing and killing people and shooting journalists. I think there's over 150 journalists now that have been killed in 2 years' time by the Israelite army. Um, and I think what you find is that okay, well, these people, in order to survive, they're going to have to do some drastic things if they're going to be able to keep their identity as Palestinians. So I think that's kind of a contemporary example that we're noticing. And then the last one is collapse extinction. Of course, that's the darkest outcome. And it's kind of the worst case scenario. And unfortunately, a lot of times within religious circles, we think that is the destiny. That's the fatalism. Well, that the world's going to collapse and be destroyed anyways. And there are passages of scripture that read that way. I'm going to read to you just a few things out of Isaiah 24 and Revelation 8 and 9. But just listen to the way Isaiah, this is in first Isaiah, the first part of the book. It says in verse 1, see, the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. It will be the same for priest as for people, for master as for his servant, for the mistress as for her servant, for the seller as for the buyer, for borrowers as for the lender, for debtor as for the creditor. The earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. The Lord has spoken the word. The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth. So when you read passages like this, you go, okay, I guess there's no other end in sight except the termination of humanity as we know it. And of course, with the possibility of nuclear war, that could very well happen. But um, I think something to keep in mind is that the Bible speaks in different voices. So the prophets often use this type of language. They're thinking near, not far, most of the time. Most of the time, the prophets aren't talking about end time. However, when you get to Revelation chapter 8 and 9, it becomes a very similar type of imagery that John the Revelator uses. So there is in chapter 8 and 9 a series of trumpets that are blown. And I'll just read a couple of them. In chapter 8, verse 7, it says, the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The names of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Now, if you take those two chapters that I just read, literally, you would say, hey, the end is near. In God's time, he's going to destroy this earth and that type of thing. The only problem is, as you'll see when we begin this Sunday morning, I'm going to talk about cosmic mending. And we're going to take a look at how the Apostle Peter, uh, in his second sermon in the book of Acts, talks about the reconciliation and the restoration of all things. And so different texts say different things. And I personally think a lot of the language in some of the prophets and certainly in the book of Revelation is symbolic in nature. They're not meant to be taken literally. But here you do have texts that people can use to say, well, humanity is going to die out, and then God is going to bring a new heaven and a new earth, as it says in Revelation 21. So, what on earth does that mean? Well, we're going to take a look at that as well on Sunday morning. So, what McLaren suggests is that we could learn a lot from indigenous people because they have a different relationship to the earth than what we, as the industrial capitalist world, has with the earth. So there are several things that are listed in this part of the book. Number one, they show a different relationship to the earth than what we have. So instead of seeing nature as primarily a resource to exploit, he suggests indigenous traditions often view the earth as part of their kin, a living sacred relative. Now, when I say indigenous, I don't mean just Native Americans. In fact, the early Jewish population that comes out of Egypt is an indigenous tribe of people that are learning to live with the earth, and much of what you find in Leviticus and that portion of the law is telling them how to live in harmony not only with each other and God but with the earth as well. So he says this worldview helps us to have more gratitude because we see our relationship with the earth, as we give to it, it gives back to us. And so a land that is not overworked and exploited will be more fruitful and that type of thing. And again, back in the Hebrew scriptures, you do find what has not often been honored, and that is leaving the land lie fallow for a year after 6 years of production, that type of thing. Secondly, he says that indigenous people help us to understand times and cycles. So when you think about a season or a year of seasons that we go through, indigenous traditions understand this cyclical nature of life and that you honor the seasons, you honor the generations, and you don't use the earth as kind of an endless means of production. So the cyclical view is to help people understand that renewal is possible, but you must respect the earth to do that. And again, back in the Hebrew scriptures, you have the same idea of letting the land lie fallow, that type of thing. Next, he says there is an interconnectedness between community and the generations that follow. So, indigenous spirituality understands that all things living, human, animal, plants, are interrelated. When we cut down too much of the forest, it affects the atmosphere. When we, don't take care of that which should be able to renew the earth, we live out the consequences of it. But he talks about making decisions with what he calls the seventh generation in mind. In other words, we tend to look at things only in the short term, but what will our kids and grandkids and great grandkids and great grandkids, what will they have to struggle with because of our short-sightedness on how we interact with the earth? Next, he talks about the practices of ritual and story. In other words, rituals of mourning and gratitude. So we do gratitude. We're thankful. We Thanksgiving is the most prominent time for things that are blessings in our life. But he suggests also that we must take times to mourn the things that we lose in life. And sometimes we run past that. We don't engage with that grief. We try to avoid it instead of allowing it to kind of change us. Next, he draws some prophetic parallels with Jesus. He talks a little bit about Jesus being an indigenous prophet of his time. Now, that's a term I have never heard used of Jesus, but it makes sense. When you think about the stories of Jesus and the parables of Jesus, they're always connected to the land a lot of times. Four types of soil, this and that. And he lives within an empire, an ecosystem that is producing wealth for the Roman Empire, and at times he draws back and he suggests a way of renewal and whether it's his own personal life pulling out from the madness and being alone to recenter himself, or whether it has to do with being more aware of the interconnectedness between human beings. And so might be a neat thing to do when you read the Gospels, to ask the question, what part of the teachings of Jesus kind of show that indigenous nature of Jesus, that he's connected to the land, and he recognizes the importance of the earth. He talks about sparrows. He talks about birds. He talks about vines, vineyards, and all kinds of things like that. So now I want to talk a little bit about how McLaren critiques um, some of the dominant, what he calls ideologies. And what we're going to do is I'm going to just kind of summarize it. And then I gave to you at the very last part of the handout, there is a chart. And on that chart, there are some scriptures that kind of correlate to these dominant ways of thinking. Okay, so we'll get to that in a moment. So he talks about capitalism, or another word for it is consumerism. And he suggests that endless growth is not possible on a finite planet. But we assume that endless growth is possible. And he says that it can reduce life to simply that of what we can consume rather than what we can renew. So he equates success, and he doesn't, but capitalism and consumerism equates success with how much wealth we have or how many possessions we own. And he says sometimes that can lead to ecological overshoot, and sometimes it will also lead to massive inequality as well. There are people that have way too much than what they could ever use, and then there's people that don't have enough to survive day by day. So, uh, dominant worldview number one is capitalism. Number two is colonialism, and it's the idea of seeing land and people and cultures only as a resource to conquer, extract, or control. It doesn't matter about who the people are or what their traditions are, what they value. What's most important is to grab the resources that they're sitting on. And so to do that, you impose a worldview as we're superior to these indigenous people, and we have a way of knowing better than they do. But in the long run, a lot of the indigenous wisdom has a way of showing that they were right about certain things. We just ignored it. McLaren says this still shapes much of our geopolitics and our economics, and in some cases, even our religion today. Um, when you think about colonialism, it's not just financial. Sometimes it can be spiritual. It's interesting to me when missionaries go overseas, they are willing to learn the language of another people, but sometimes they want to put that particular people group into an American version of Christianity. And so it happens on all types of different levels. Next is what he calls white supremacy or racism, the idea that white identity is the ideal. And then he talks a little bit about how that is often exploited through segregation, systemic inequality. Most recently, it's interesting to me, all the talk about gerrymandering that's going on, how it's going to be able to get more seats for a particular political group. And both sides are doing it. They're doing it down in Texas right now, and they're doing it, they're thinking about doing it out in California. And it's a way of, we're going to force how we divide up the voting scheme here to make sure that we are the most powerful and we can stay in power. And often he suggests that marginalized voices are pushed aside as a result of that. Then he talks a little bit about patriarchy, how men tend to dominate over women, masculine power kind of devalues the contribution of women, and sometimes it can fuel domination mindsets. In certain cultures, the man has the last say. Um, the women's opinion is disregarded. Next is what he calls extraction and domination of nature, seeing the earth simply as an object to exploit, treating water, soil, animals, ecosystems as commodities rather than gifts that God has given to us. Next, he talks about religious complacency. And he suggests that Christianity has often been baptized in the waters of empire. And it's rather tough to resist what you're swimming in. And this idea of otherworldly salvation allows people to get off the hook a little bit and suggests that we can just use the world any way that we want. Way back in Genesis, when God told Adam and Eve that they are to be fruitful and multiply, and they are to, have dominion over the earth. Well, a lot of people think of that dominion as control, as simply using it, rather than seeing it as a stewardship where we are to take care of that which God has given to us. Next is what he calls is technological utopianism, um, thinking that technology will solve every problem. Technology does solve a lot of problems. On the other hand, too, AI is going to put a lot of people out of work. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. How are they going to make a living? The more we rely upon AI, will it deepen injustice? Will it deepen environmental harm? Will it deepen the inability of people to put food on the table for their family? That's yet to be seen. So the way he kind of concludes this book is he talks about these ideologies, and then he says that these can be old scripts of doom that are very powerful, but that the Spirit of God can help us to let go of some of that and stop living by some of the masquerades that living within that system produces. So he talks about the way of Jesus as a way of gratitude, kinship, equality, and partnership, reverence for creation, prophetic courage, and humble stewardship. And when we look at the Beatitudes, it kind of encapsulates many of these similar things that he is stating. Um, again, he is talking about Jesus giving us wisdom if we are willing to learn from him. So he then says maybe the old scripts that we live by, greed, domination, and despair, can be responded to by the words and teachings of Jesus, which at times means enough's enough, that we are all kin as a human race. We are one in Christ. We're brothers and sisters. Creation is sacred. Justice is God's calling in our life, and that the earth belongs to the Lord. So, before I look at this chart, is there some thoughts that you have, some questions or comments that you have? And then I'm going to take a look at the chart just to kind of show you some of the scripture verses that can kind of be contemplated against some of these ideologies that he suggests in the book. Anything on your mind? Okay, so the way this chart is organized is in the left column is kind of the dominant ideas, or what he calls the doom script: capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, domination of nature, religious complacency, and technological utopianism. So we've just talked about that. In the middle column is what he suggests is the life giving path, that simplicity and gratitude counteracts overwhelming consumerism, that kinship and reciprocity can overcome colonialism, that equality and diversity can overcome white supremacy, that mutuality and partnership can overcome the gender divide, that sacred creation can overcome the domination of nature, that prophetic spirituality, faith, is more than just a trust for the afterlife, but it is faith that reveals itself as resistance and justice and earth centered renewal. And then lastly, humility and limits, understanding our limits, can counteract sometimes technological utopianism or overshoot. So where can we turn in the scriptures that might help us understand that? Well, some of these verses, I think are helpful. In contrast to capitalism and over consumerism, Jesus says in Matthew 6:19 and 21 through 21, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up treasures in heaven. Keep your perspective. In colonialism, Acts 17:26 and 27 says, from one ancestor he made all nations so that they would seek God. In other words, there's not one people group that is better than another. God shows no partiality. White supremacy, Galatians 3:28. There's no longer Jew or Greek, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. In other words, uh, the longer version of that verse is there's no Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. You're all one in Christ. Then Genesis 1:27, male and female, he created them in the image of God. The men are not superior over women, that there's a mutuality there. Domination of nature is Romans 8:19 through 22. Creation waits with eager longing that it will be set free from its bondage to decay. Creation is given a voice in this verse. It's as if it's crying out, don't you know what you're doing to me? You're killing me here. And it looks forward to the day of liberation. Religious complacency, ignoring injustice. Of course, Micah 6:8, that famous verse. What does the Lord require of you? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly before God. And then lastly, technological utopianism is Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. What we have, we steward. What we have is given to us for a short period of time, and we are to take care of it and not to ignore it and not to overuse it. So I think that chart kind of helps, kind of put the whole book into perspective. It's a good read. I always enjoy reading McLaren. He was an English teacher in a university, so the way he writes is very fluid, and I enjoy it. So, that summarizes kind of what you'll find in the pages of the book. And let me stop our share. We'll kind of talk a little bit more and see if you have some things that you want to talk about. And I'm also going to stop the recording.